momentarily. The format is a special one. Ada and Paula will be offering opening remarks and then we'll be in conversation with one another, as scholars often are across our two campuses. You will not only get to glimpse into that conversation, you will then get to ask your own questions. And so I encourage you to begin filling our Q&A as soon as you have your questions. And my colleague, Sarah Connell, the Director of Communications at the Graham School, will be reading those and will be getting them ready for Ada and Paula. And now on to the event. The Renaissance is famously described as an era of rebirth, the creation of a new world at the end of the Middle Ages. But what exactly does this mean and how did it occur? We have two outstanding scholars who will be investigating that topic. Paula Findlen is the Ubaldo Periati Professor of History and Professor by Courtesy of French and Italian. She has taught the early history of science and medicine for many years on the premise that one of the most important ways to understand how science, medicine, and technology have become so central to contemporary society comes from examining the process by which scientific knowledge emerged. Her other principal interest lies in understanding the world of the Renaissance, with a particular focus on Italy. Ada Palmer is Associate Professor of Early Modern European History in the College at the University of Chicago. She is a cultural and intellectual historian focusing on radical thought and the recovery of the classics in early modern Europe, especially the Italian Renaissance. With affiliations in classics, gender studies, and the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge, she works on the history of science, religion, free thought, atheism, censorship, books, printing, and the networks of money and power that enable cultural production. She is also an avid science fiction and fantasy novelist, and I will say that she is very popular in that regard, and I know many who know her as science fiction author and who love that side of her inventive and creative persona. And so with that, let me turn it over to Professor Findlen to get us started.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Seth. And it's such a pleasure to be here and to share my thoughts about the invention of the Renaissance. And, you know, Ada and I are going to take somewhat different approaches. I'm going to tell you about something that I have long thought about since I was a kid going to museums. I grew up, you know, in and around New York City. And I also spent a lot of time in the DC area. And of course, like a lot of kids, you know, my relatives, my parents, my grandparents would take me to museums. And there were a lot of things that fascinated me about museums that led me to ultimately become, among other things, a historian of museums and collecting. But one of the things I came to think about later on when I was studying the Renaissance as a graduate student was the role of the art museum in the invention of the Renaissance. So I want to share some of my thoughts on this subject and get you thinking about, hopefully in a certain sense, seeing this aspect of museums the next time you enter one. So let me start with a really famous quote from one of the canonical early books written on the Renaissance by a French historian named Jules Michelet. So in 1855, Jules Michelet is the first historian to write a book with the title, The Renaissance, right? This is the first time there is a book that has this title. So that's a book that predates the Swiss-German historian Jakob Burckhardt's Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, which will appear in 1860. So you can see this is a very formative moment. But there is one of many interesting passages in Michelet's The Renaissance that I want to quote here. There's at one point that Michelet invites you, as he says, go into the Louvre, right? So go into the Louvre, this famous art museum. In the large gallery on the left, you have the old world, the new one on the right. So what is he inviting us to look at? What is the old world? For him, the old world is a painting by Fra Angelico from the 15th century. And the new world is a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. And then he says, comparing these two paintings and these two artists, right? One representing the old, the other representing the new. Opposite this ancient mysticism, i.e. the mysticism of Fra Angelico, in the pictures of da Vinci shines the spirit of the Renaissance at its most fierce, sharp, and restless. So in this very long book filled with all sorts of literary and historical references is a moment in which Michelet invites us to enter the most important museum in his world and see that the Renaissance is different from what comes before. So I have long been fascinated by this because I've had that experience myself, and it has to do with how we tell history in museums, how in fact we organize objects and reorganize objects to express a history that we would like to see, but a history that we also write about. So I want to get you thinking about this idea that Michelet is, among other things, a historian inspired by the museum to write about this thing he calls the Renaissance. So where does this idea come from? As some of you know, the word Renaissance has its origins. The word Renaissance is a French word, of course, right? But it has its origins in an Italian word, rinascita, right? Rebirth. Rinascita that appears in the most famous work of Renaissance art historical writing, really a work that we attribute to the birth of art history, the Florentine painter and architect Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artist, that appears first in 1550 and then in an expanded edition in 1568. And in this book, at one key moment, having organized the history of the arts with Tuscany at the center of his story, Vasari tells us that he is describing what he calls the progress of art's rebirth. The progress of art's rebirth is his rinascita. Well, Vasari, of course, is telling this initially through lives, right? Lives of individual artists, including Leonardo. The apogee of Vasari's story is Michelangelo. The beginning is people, earlier artists, right, of the Tuscan world, Cimabue, Giotto, etc. But we also know that between the first and the second edition, Vasari goes out on a hunting and gathering mission, encouraged by colleagues who have supported and facilitated the early version of his work to think more about works rather than lives. What are the surviving artifacts of this rinascita? So Vasari begins to assemble these things on paper. And what I want you to think about is the story of the migration of a word, of an idea from text to exhibit by the time we get to Michelet's world in the 19th century. So how did rinascita come to define both a historical epoch and a way of arranging and looking at art? Well, like many histories, this is an erratic story with a lot of silences and gaps and halting stories, but I want to give you a few highlights in my preliminary remarks. So Vasari's book is out there, it's widely read, it's translated, it will be an enduring bestseller, right? We still read it today when we take art history classes or when we want to know about the art of the Renaissance. So here's an interesting moment. Let's fast forward to the 1610s and take a look at a book written by a physician and art critic in Rome, not Tuscany, named Giulio Mancini, who writes a manuscript, he doesn't publish it, called Considerations on Painting in the 1610s. And he starts talking about what he calls ancient painting, but his ancient painting is not ancient in the sense that it's from antiquity. It's actually from what we would call the Renaissance, right? The 15th, the 16th century, because he lives in the 17th century, right? So he can now talk about that. How does he describe this antiquity, this new antiquity that's not, from Greece or Rome or Egypt? He says he's talking about objects that are those of the Renaissance century. Quelli del secolo rinascente. So this is like a tree falling in a forest, right? Because it's in a manuscript that is, certainly known in a local circle, but it's not widely read. It's much more well-known nowadays than it was at the time. But to me, it's a very interesting example of somebody who is talking about this. Why? Because he's talking about how to organize a Baroque art gallery that includes paintings from this Renaissance century. And he is trying to describe how important it is in his mind to organize a collection of art by material, by method, by time, and by school, as he then tells us right after this phrase, the Renaissance century. So this is a phrase that is not widely used in either the 16th or 17th century to simply deposit it in various places by Vasari, by Mancini, and so forth. And it's really not until the middle of the 18th century that we begin to see this word appear with greater frequency in a variety of different contexts. And one of the important ones, before we get to the story of the Louvre, is the Uffizi. The Uffizi, in fact, this is actually a really interesting story. It has a delicious irony. How did a building that Giorgio Vasari, the architect, designed as a set of office buildings to house basically the Tuscan administration, and it's what I like to call the Renaissance military industrial complex. We think of it as an art gallery. That's not its original use. How did it come to house his Renaissance? Because the Uffizi is the canonical Renaissance museum, right? Hands down. How did that happen? Okay, here is another famous moment in the history of the Uffizi. Another visitor going to a museum, 1764, Edward Gibbon, before he writes The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire that will make him famous. Edward Gibbon comes to Florence. He stays there for 3 weeks in July. He visits the Uffizi 14 times during those 3 weeks. And on his second visit, on July 5th, 1764, he writes the following in his diary, looking at objects in the Uffizi. And he says, "Here one sees a series of paintings of the most ancient masters before the Renaissance of painting." He's using the French word. He's actually writing his whole diary in French, by the way. "And one can follow all the steps that this art made until its perfection." So here he's looking at before the Renaissance of painting, and one can follow all the steps that this art made until its perfection. And so what is he pointing to? Again, he points to Fra Angelico as before the Renaissance. And his example of the Renaissance is Raphael's Julius II that's in the Uffizi in 1764, not Leonardo. There is no Leonardo in the Uffizi until the end of this century. So here we see Gibbon, clearly somebody who has read Vasari, now applying it. But actually, when you read the fuller passage, he's not seeing what he describes. That's aspirational, because he goes on to critique the disorganization of the Uffizi, that it's not offering a clean, clear narrative of the kind he would like to see and is describing. He can see it in the objects, but it's not, as he says, well organized. And by contrast, when he goes to the drawings room and looks at the drawings, he thinks they're much better organized. And he says, here, I can look at the drawings and I can see them sense Cimabue and Giotto. That's practically a quote, right, from Vasari. So we know that he is a really good reader of Vasari's lives. So the 1770s is the period in which the Uffizi makes a transition from an early modern cabinet of curiosities filled with arms, armor, artisanal workmanship, all sorts of different things, into something more like a paintings gallery, and one that also is self-consciously a Florentine museum that has, as one of the curators put it in the 1770s, the rarest Tuscan thing. So they begin to shove out all the stuff that's not that and create a nucleus around that, while also building in other things like Raphael, right, that they think they should affiliate with this glorious set of Tuscan things. So it's in the 1770s, for instance, that they begin to sketch out what they call a cabinet of ancient painting that basically has the nucleus of what today is the Renaissance collection. So for instance, one curator in 1782 describes what they're going to do in the cabinet of ancient painting in the Uffizi as he puts it, a series following the order of Vasari. A couple years later, another director of the museum gets permission from the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Peter Leopold, to create, as he calls it, a complete visual history of the Renaissance of painting. They're all reading Vasari. They are walking through the galleries with Vasari, now trying to realize this as a blueprint for a museum. And in fact, it's in this period that Vasari now gets described basically as the inventor of the Uffizi, and now they mean the art gallery, right? They've conflated the building and, the narrative. So all of this is interesting background to conclude and turn this over to my colleague for the exhibit that inspired Jules Michelet to write the Renaissance in 1855. In 1822, an exhibit opened at the Louvre called the Museum of the Renaissance. It initially wasn't open to the public, and it had 4 sculptures in it. 2 of them were Michelangelo's unfinished captives that had arrived in the Louvre in 1793 from the detritus of Cardinal Richelieu's collection from one of his heirs. And the other 2, interestingly, were not what we would call Renaissance objects. They were sculptures by Canova, right, by this great sculptor of the Napoleonic era. By 1835, this had opened to the public, and it stayed open to the public until 1849, when the Louvre also did a massive reorganization of their collection and began to do something kind of like what I've outlined with the Uffizi, to create a broad historical narrative into which they deposited the objects. But needless to say, what Michelet visited was this early exhibit called the Museum of the Renaissance with Michelangelo's 2 captives. And we know this because he left behind a very interesting diary. And so, for instance, in 1840, he says in his diary in October of 1840, he declares, "This year, my course that he's teaching at the Collège de France should be on what he calls the monuments of the Renaissance." And then a few days later, he goes to this exhibit and he talks with friends, and he talks about seeing Michelangelo's captives. And by December of 1840, he has given a lecture on the Renaissance at the Collège de France. This will lay the foundations for, of course, his book in 1855. So, to conclude at this point, I want you to think about how the historians who invented the Renaissance in the 19th century were some of the greatest tourists and connoisseurs of this period. Burckhardt, for example, in his own lifetime, was not well known for the civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. He was well known for a book called The Cicerone, an Introduction to the Enjoyment of Works of Art in Italy, that he published in 1855 in German, that was a bestseller in many, many languages. A young American art connoisseur and dealer and collector, Bernard Berenson, would take a copy of Burckhardt's Cicerone with him to Italy in the 1880s. So thank you very much. I look forward to the continuation of the conversation about inventing the Renaissance.
And to continue both topically and chronologically, when we're looking at the reader and the moment in the late 1800s that is shaped by Michelet's book and that is shaped by Burckhardt's books, one of the most fascinating and accessible primary source figures we can turn to for a glimpse of what the Renaissance meant in 1900 is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's extremely self-contradictory and fascinating depictions of Sherlock Holmes's knowledges of art and literature, which may seem like an odd source, but when he first introduces Holmes in Study in Scarlet, he has Watson give a sort of a portrait of Holmes's level of knowledge of different topics, because he finds it fascinating that there is this idiosyncratic autodidact who has taught himself chemistry, but only chemistry that's related to crime, and medicine profoundly, but knows so little of astronomy that he doesn't even know that the Earth goes around the sun. And when Watson describes his knowledge of literature, he puts it at nil. And when he describes his understanding of art, he describes it as art of which he had the crudest opinions. But when we then in the stories see Holmes in action, Holmes, a figure who is described by Watson as having nil knowledge of literature and the crudest opinions of art, can effortlessly spot and recognize the artist who did different paintings when he sees them in the house in Baskerville Manor in The Hound of the Baskervilles, and can recognize that the portrait above Moriarty's desk is a Kreuger and look up how much it's worth. Because even a gentleman with the crudest opinions of art, Doyle can't imagine being unable to do that. And similarly, despite his knowledge of literature being, quote, nil, when Holmes and Watson are on a train on their way to a case and have finished discussing it, and now it's time for time to pass, what he has Holmes say is, now here is my pocket Petrarch, and let's have no more discussion until we get there. So knowledge of literature nil still means recreationally reading Petrarch. So Doyle is unable to imagine that an educated gentleman of 1900, even one remarkable for his lack of knowledge of art and literature, wouldn't nonetheless be versed in museums, galleries, collecting, and Petrarch and other literatures, which he also quotes, of the Renaissance era. That between the 1850s and 1900, the importance of the Grand Tour and the centrality of this cultural knowledge as being one of the proofs of a gentleman has only increased. This is also, historically, as we're very well aware, a period of the crystallization and rise of nationalism. And it meant that the invented Renaissance, which by the time you get to 1850, has an idea of a moment of artistic rebirth, which has become a central one, that to be an educated gentleman or lady, you must have visited the Uffizi, you must be familiar with the Louvre. If you haven't done it in person, you have read armchair travel books so that you're familiar with these places. When the 19th century's nationalist movements are growing, they have this at its core, which means that the Renaissance's ongoing construction gets wrapped up in the rise of nationalism. So within Italy, Italian nationalism is, we can claim the Renaissance as a moment of our greatness. Within other nations' nationalisms, for example, ideas of the French Renaissance, the English literary Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, get nominated as proofs of the excellence of those particular nations. Other countries that have a harder time claiming a Renaissance more directly will begin claiming a Renaissance secondarily, whether by claiming that to have a particular core figure who either equated or surpassed or collected it. This is also a period in which you begin to see histories written, especially in Germany or England, that talk about how Italy had a Renaissance and then went into decline after insert chosen date here, as its degeneracy or the corruption of Catholicism or whatever else it is meant that the true spirit of the Renaissance had to migrate to England, to France, to Germany, so that one could claim the French Enlightenment as a continuation, or one could claim the Protestant ethic of the spirit of capitalism as where the rational and human-centered and creative spirit of the Renaissance migrated to. As a result of which you developed a set of competitions about claiming the Renaissance and a wide variety of methods for claiming the Renaissance, whether claiming our nation can claim the Renaissance because we produced it or because we collected it when others were beginning to let it be neglected, when others were letting Renaissance masterpieces sit in their basements and no longer valuing them. We, the prudent British, we, the prudent Americans, went to Italy and collected and nurtured them. The same kind of claim that museums can make about the Elgin marbles or other things that they'll say they rescued from neglect. Those kinds of methods, or being able to claim that somehow the Renaissance was stifled in Italy, whether by external conquest, by the presence of Spain in the lower half, and therefore that you can claim that the true spirit of the Renaissance went to X other place. These are all tools that result in, by the time you reach the 20th century, the Renaissance, and zooming out from it, the idea of a golden age coming after a dark age in an abstract sense, becoming a very useful tool of self-fashioning in itself, something that a political party, a political movement, an individual, a nation trying to aspire to have an empire, a nation trying to justify itself on the world stage, a nation undergoing a regime change and trying to legitimate that regime change, can borrow either the Renaissance specifically or the zoomed out archetype more broadly of being a golden age after a dark age, potentially a golden age which claims to be reviving an earlier golden age as a way of legitimizing, claiming to be returning to an authentic spirit, claiming to, I hate to quote this one, but it really is a version of this, make something great again. That vocabulary enters a political world, also worlds you can claim, my educational reforms are a rebirth of something, my artistic movement is a rebirth of something. The notion of this division into ancient golden age, bad middle age, and then golden age again, comes to be abstractable and applicable widely, thanks to the development toward the rebirth notion, and then the way it gets employed and redeployed and developed very sophisticatedly by a diversity of nationalisms in the late 19th and early to mid 20th centuries. This also results in, as people start accepting, okay, the Renaissance is defined as good. We therefore want to figure out what caused the Renaissance. What was the root of the Renaissance? What made that golden age happen? Because whatever it was good. And over the course of especially the 20th century, you have a diversity of different nominees of what caused the Renaissance. Some of them are reductivist. One nomination being the development of sophisticated banking methods, double entry bookkeeping, elaborate systems of lending, the rise of Florentine banking wealth, which then triggers a giant economic boom that then enables all the production of treasures and so on. That is one narrative you find of what causes the Renaissance. Another narrative you find of what causes the Renaissance is an idea of breaking free from superstition. That a variety of discoveries or contexts, whether it's antiquity and its non-Christian thought coming in, or whether it's scientific discoveries, resulted in breaking free from the chains of superstition and a rise of rationalist thought, or centering the human being above divinity, and that causes this explosion. I'm intentionally being vague in these and not giving you individual names because the history of each is complex, but the point of this is that it generates a situation in which, if you can claim that you know what caused the Renaissance, and then claim that whatever you are doing is the continuation of what caused the Renaissance, you can then claim that your set of practices, organization, political party, whatever it is therefore the correct path of modernity. Because the idea of the Renaissance got so caught up with the idea of modernity. The Middle Ages is definitively pre-modernity, and that the Renaissance is somehow this transformation, this threshold, this switching over to modernity. And so if you can claim double entry bookkeeping and the rise of proto-capitalism sparked the Renaissance, boy, is that a popular argument to then be repeated in newspapers and magazines during the Cold War, when the capitalism versus communism claims about which is the true path of humanity were hot. And people could say, well, the Renaissance was caused by proto-capitalism, proving that capitalism is the correct path. Or similarly, there are claims about the Renaissance having been caused by the development of sort of increased trade and circulation and what you could call internationalism. And you see people who are globalist and anti-installationist invoking that as the continuity and continuation of what was clearly the path of modernity. When people talk about whether there was a secularizing turn within the Renaissance, and whether one of the characteristics of the Renaissance was there suddenly being more non-religious cultural activity, or even anti-religious cultural activity, something which is very vexed and that historians argue fiercely about. But when you see people advancing the idea of a secular Renaissance, it's very often with the corollary of, and therefore the movement away from religiosity and toward a dominance of secularism and secularization is the correct path forward for modernity. So the Renaissance comes to be invoked enormously widely as a tool of legitimacy for claims about modernity, and for the claim that the particular thing you are doing is the future of modernity. Possibly one of the most familiar for a lot of people is democracy, because especially since Burckhardt and other early collections were so fascinated with it, and the Uffizi is in it, Florence gets celebrated as a cradle of the Renaissance and center of the Renaissance. Vasari constructs it that way. And Florence was peculiar by being a republic. It was not a democratic republic. It was a weird republic. They used lotteries and all sorts of fascinating systems that were very different from an electoral modern democracy. But it was a republic, and it had a lot of republican pride and produced a lot of yet celebrate republicanism, political thought. And Venice was a second center of Renaissance productivity, a lot of which was seen on the Grand Tour, because Venice was an important and beautiful stop on the Grand Tour, which led to the construction of histories of the Renaissance, which claim what enabled the Renaissance: republicanism and republican thought. One of the figures involved in this is Hans Baron, another important German historian of the Renaissance, who argues that humanism and the type of stimulating political thought that characterized the Renaissance flourished specifically in the republics because it was nurtured by ideas of strong civic identity and an identity of civic participation. And when that claim is made, a oversimplified version of that claim can be the Renaissance was enabled by proto-democracy, therefore proving that democracy is the tool for breaking free from the bad elements of the past and moving to the excellent elements of the present. Therefore, this proves that democracy is the correct path for humanity, something that could be used, for example, in 19th century empires to justify erasing indigenous governments and replacing them with democratically modeled European-styled governments, because they were clearly the correct path. Look at all of the wonderful things the Renaissance produced as a result. So as we move forward from the constructions Paula has described, in which absolutely these museums and this experience and expectation that every educated person, every educated gentleman and woman has familiarity with the Uffizi and with these works of the Renaissance, as that moves from being proof of being cultured to therefore being proof that this era was an excellent era, and therefore that if you can determine the cause of that era, the X factor, the ingredient that made it happen, and you are continuing that ingredient, you must be on the correct path of human progress, came to make the Renaissance be one of the most widely invoked tools of historical legitimation for modern things, whether what you're legitimating is a political party or a corporation who has a Renaissance image in its logo, or a bank that has a Renaissance neoclassicizing pediment on the bank facade, which is modeled much more on Renaissance imitations of antiquity than directly on antiquity. So that this process, which began in the Renaissance, and in a moment we'll begin the dialogue half of this because I'm excited to discuss it back and forth with Paula, in a way that began in the Renaissance itself and its use of art and culture and of classicizing images has become, through many stages, a kind of a language of power that can be used to make claims of culturedness, civilizedness, legitimacy, being on the correct path forward, and a number of other things, which has meant that in addition to being an important node in our understanding of historical eras one by one, it's one of the ones that has had the most political consequences. And as we see, even white supremacist groups claiming medieval and Renaissance imagery when advancing their own fringe political claims, what we're seeing are the re-implementations of the toolkit that the Renaissance became, a toolkit of historical legitimation. And so I would love to pass it back to Paula and do our back and forth about how the invention of the Renaissance then becomes the transformation of the Renaissance into a set of tools which have this diversity of uses.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Ada. That's, you raised so many different issues about the multiple inventions, right, of this subject across the centuries, and of course the ends to which it served. And so one thing I think of in response is and I'm sure you'll have a great list, is to think about the fictional Renaissance and the way in which, and I was thinking about your comments on Arthur Conan Doyle. Of course, I was remembering back and want to recommend to our audience, George Eliot's Romulus, which is set in Savonarola's
Yes.
Florence, right? The Florence of this fiery preacher at the end of the 15th century who seems so unmodern. And, so in many ways, that tension between the old and the new. So you be like, when do people begin to fictionalize the Renaissance? Well, George Eliot is a good example of that, just as the way these kinds of the reading of Petrarch, the being a connoisseur, sort of, as you say, of art and literature, is embodied in the characteristics of Sherlock Holmes. And so we could also sort of think about how fictionalizing the Renaissance also ends up being a mirror of these many different inventions, don't you think?
Yeah. Well, and there's a continuity because the Renaissance, as we both understand very well, Paula, is very long enough that in the later Renaissance, figures that we still think of as being from the same era are looking back at earlier ones. So there is also a tradition, especially in playwriting, of setting plays in Renaissance Italy, which Shakespeare is already doing, and what John Webster is already doing. And the Romulo is in continuity with a bunch of plays that are written all the way through from when these events are live, all the way through the Renaissance and through the 17th and 18th centuries, and develop into the operas that are set in the Renaissance as well. The Borgias are famous because of the fictionalized multiplication of them beyond. And that gets into the very interesting, what I sometimes call secondary historiography of the imagined Renaissance, which is the Renaissance of romance, not exclusively in the love romance sense, but in the dramatic settings where operas and murders and femme fatales are set. Because that is another important component of the construction of the Renaissance, which we see in fiction, which we see in opera, which we see in plays, and which we also see in a missing piece of that 19th century historiography and very early 20th century historiography of the Renaissance, because so many women went to Florence and wrote things, working in the archives outside of standard academia, because gender was still placing a lot of barriers, but produced works like, oh no, the name is escaping me.
Are you thinking of Julia Cartwright?
Janet Ross. I'm thinking of Janet Ross, but Cartwright
yeah,
is also
Janet Ross,
similar.
Definitely, but also Julia Cartwright, right?
Yeah, these people who
best-selling histories.
Exactly. They travel to Florence, they go to the archives, they write best-selling histories, but that tend, unlike what you're finding in Burckhardt and Michelet, which are, can we capture the genius spirit of this age, are much more, can we capture the stories and passions of the people who lived in these palaces? What were the stories of these palaces? What was going on in the fascinating and dramatic world of the Renaissance, which leads to the side of going back to Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, when so often Holmes, is talking about some dramatic thing that's happening between his British characters and saying, thank goodness things like this don't happen in the Latin countries, the countries of assassination, or everyone would kill each other. That there is this sense of romance and violence and drama associated with the Renaissance as well, as a kind of an alluring underbelly. And we need to integrate this into the historiography, because so many 20th century historians, when you ask them, why did you start studying the Renaissance? Sometimes the answer is, I went on a trip to the Louvre, I went on a trip to the Met. But sometimes it's, I read one of these best-selling histories of the Renaissance, often written by women, often written outside of the academy in a sense, but that intertwined with it and create a golden age, but with a dramatic underbelly as an image of the Renaissance.
Well, and that your comments about that idea of the stories and passions that inspire people and that turn into fiction. Also, in general, and the role of women in this also makes me think of the female collectors. especially
Yes.
Isabella Stewart Gardner. Again, to go back to connect it to museums. Isabella Stewart Gardner. There will be some people in the audience who've been to the Gardner Museum in Boston. And this is a very particular and different kind of Renaissance museum than the ones I talked about in my earlier presentation, because it is about living with the Renaissance. What does Isabella Stewart Gardner want to do? She's traveled, she's seen all this stuff, and she wants to not just buy it and stick it in her house. She wants to build a Venetian palace on the Fenway in Boston. She wants to literally inhabit the Renaissance. And And, so particular is she about this that even today, the terms of the trust mean that nothing can be changed. So the paintings that are stolen are blank spaces on the wall because nothing can be changed, but of course, for her at the time, before it became a museum and got fixed in this way, for her, it was this kind of lived experience. And that's a big part of, the 19th century is filled with people who are living in these pseudo-Renaissance, palaces, villas, homes.
Yeah. Bernard Berenson's home and collection is the same, which, like the Gardner Museum, gets ossified and is now a research institute in Florence, but it still has his collection of Renaissance art all distributed through the home, through the library, as it was living in this fascinating reconstruction of, we're not just studying and trying to capture the spirit of the age, but also to live and relive in a palace-like environment that is an idealization and stylized version of the way the Renaissance lived, in almost the same relationship with the Renaissance that the Renaissance had to antiquity, of trying to recreate pseudo-classical spaces, none of which are actually what a real classical space was like, because they're layering things on top of each other. There's a wonderful art history PhD student here at Chicago finishing up, Hilary Barker, who's been working on how a lot of the most innovative Renaissance classicizing facades, things that combine very interesting architectural elements. You can go to Rome and you can find particular views in which three different ruined Roman buildings in front of each other, viewed from one particular angle, have all of those elements that the Renaissance facade has in each other, that they're combining buildings that were originally built several centuries apart, but that once ruined and standing next to each other and sketched by someone who is visiting Rome, produce a sketch which have the pediment on top of the curvy part on top of this row of windows, which then becomes the Renaissance building, which isn't something Cicero would ever recognize if he was time traveling, but is something that looks fully classical to the Renaissance viewer who has seen it in a ruined form. And similarly, the Berenson House or the Gardner Museum look Renaissance from the point of view of their contemporaries. But if a real Renaissance person walked through them, they would be full of things that are strange and wouldn't be put together that way, because it's an imagined idealization above and beyond and over the top. Similarly to the fascinating Bernard Berenson's art collection contains several fakes that successfully duped him. And the women's faces in the fakes that successfully dupe him look conspicuously like Hollywood starlets who were big in the decade in which those fakes were produced. But because that was the style of beauty at the time, it looked right to somebody looking at this fake right then. It doesn't look right to us. It wouldn't look right to Leonardo if you sent that painting back in time. But it looked right in that exact decade because it mixed the tastes of the Renaissance with the tastes which people within that decade didn't realize were temporally specific and were just generic beauty.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I mean, we're always in search of the past that we want, and right, the past that in a way is a mirror of our present. And of course, I can't help but say that for benefit of the audience too, is that one of the best litmus tests of the changing understanding of the Renaissance is the myth of Leonardo.
Yes.
So that's another thing we could have also given a formal presentation on, but just informally, I mean, over the years, I have a longstanding passion for Leonardo. I teach a course on Leonardo's world, and in 2019 we did a whole, for the big Leonardo anniversary, we brought out a lot of speakers. We reconstructed Leonardo's library as an exhibit here, and did a lot of things. But on and off, I have to say that I have been fascinated with the way, starting in roughly the 1990s, you began to sort of see this kind of new Leonardo, who's not the old Leonardo of the museum that still is alive and well, that's famously written about by Victorian art critics like Walter Pater with his famous essay on the Mona Lisa. But something as banal as an ad for a tech company. I think the earliest one I saw was actually for I don't think it was Microsoft even. I think it was Xerox, believe it or not, that just had this picture of Leonardo's head floating next to one of their machines, and it said, "If Leonardo were alive today, he'd work for us." And it's such a banal, unlike the political story that you were outlining so well. It's such a banal but telling example, right? Of we've made him the embodiment of the most creative impulses of the Renaissance. And what do we want to do with it now? We want him to work for us. And I see that working in Silicon Valley, that I am, somewhat regularly asked by people either at the university or outside of the university to do, the Leonardo talk, as I call it, because they're all about creativity and invention and entrepreneurship and a kind of Renaissance futurism. And they'd like me to, talk about, the wellspring, the touchstone of this that is Leonardo.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. That I've been recently finishing up a draft book which has a bunch of mini biographies of different Renaissance figures, and there's a whole lot of them. And more than once, people have read the draft and said, "Oh, it was great. It was lovely. I was wondering why you didn't do Leonardo. And what does it mean for there to be a century, or actually 3 centuries?" And then there's one figure where, when someone has written 30 biographies of people from this era, most of whom the reader has not heard of before, most of whom are, Camilla Rucellai and Raffaele Maffeo Volaterrano, people you've never heard of, for not someone to nonetheless say, "Why didn't you do this one person out of all the people that were in the world in this entire set of 3 centuries?" But it'll always be Leonardo people ask about. He has become such a subject of the imagination that people struggle with, well, but wasn't he really important in the time? The answer is, well, kinda. But I bet if you polled people in 1500 who are going to be the top 10 names remembered from your century, he wouldn't be on the majority of lists. Might be on a couple, but they would be really surprised by that compared to, King Charles, who conquered Italy, or other such things that would have been more in their imagination. I remember being on a panel at a science fiction convention in France, where we got to talking about history, and I was talking about, Leonardo, he's very interesting. Artists like that were important, but they weren't considered super central. And he was saying, well, but Leonardo's salary was, 500 a year. Wasn't that enormous? And I said, well, yeah, but it was a bit lower than the court lute player, and it was about a quarter of the court dwarf. So when you're saying that it's a big number, what are you comparing it to? Who are the most important people at court? And everyone in the room was just flabbergasted to realize that Leonardo was in the middle of importance.
That's a great world. Right, or the salary of a philosophy professor, some name you've never ever heard of, right? Cesare Cremonini, highest paid professor at the University of Padua in the age of Galileo, way more money than Galileo, for one.
Yes.
And then Leonardo. And so I think that putting him in the middle is a great. So then why have we extracted him, right? Because that is our Renaissance, that's not their Renaissance.
And what do we want from the Renaissance? We want particular things, and we don't want other particular things. I've been looking at a couple of different Renaissance women who are well known. There's a figure, Alessandra Scala. Somebody's not muted so that it's making noise. I'm not sure what that is, but Alessandra Scala, who is a daughter of Bartolomeo Scala, Chancellor of Florence. She's within the Medici patronage circuit in the 1480s and 1490s. She was studying Latin and Greek. She composed poetry in Greek. She performed in Greek as Electra in a play. We have descriptions of her by Poliziano and by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. She then marries a Greek scholar, Michele Marullo, is widowed, enters a nunnery, and eventually dies there. And there's a lot of fascination with her as the ideal female humanist. And she does Latin, and she does Greek, and she does theater, and she's hanging out with our superstar male human. People really want to celebrate her. And there's a lot of deep analysis of her relationships, potentially romantic, And very little of her life is a nun. Like nobody who studied her and written about her has bothered to go to the nunnery and look at the papers and trace that 2/3 of her life, because that's not what we want from a Renaissance woman. We want the poetess who's hanging around with Lorenzo de' Medici and Pico della Mirandola, and we don't want the nun. And I was looking at several different Renaissance women for these bios. One of them ended up being Camilla Rucellai, who is a woman who, from the modern POV, does everything wrong. She's, a Florentine woman. She marries a good merchant. She's in the center of the banking class. Everything's going great. And then she gets really excited by Savonarola, and she starts having mystic visions, and she convinces her husband that they should give up their banking business and separate, and he should become a monk and she should become a nun. And she continues to have visions and advise Savonarola on how to lead the Republic. And he's making political decisions which determine the fate of the city based on her. She has 100 times as much political influence as Alessandra Scala ever could have. But we don't want to study Camilla Rucellai because that's not the kind of female power we want our Renaissance woman to be exercising. We don't want it to be mystical, and we don't want it to be Christian. We want it to be involved in the classics and literature and all these things. We pick and choose the Renaissance figures that fit the Renaissance we're excited by, in the same way that when you watch a movie set in the Renaissance from 30 or 40 years ago, or set in ancient Greece, boy, do they pick the hairstyles that looked good to them then, right? And our contemporary Renaissance dramas are picking the Renaissance hairstyles that look good to us now. And in 20 years or 30 years, when we watch 2020 era Renaissance dramas, we're going to say, boy, they sure picked the Renaissance hairstyles that looked like 2020 hairstyles. And it's not that they're inaccurate. Is that we're picking the 10% of the things that fit our tastes.
Yeah.
And Alessandro Scala is that, Leonardo is that.
Well, or also just to add to that in terms of thinking about what Renaissance women are to our taste, right? The women of Leonardo's painting, right? We want to give them personalities, we want to give them lives. History provides so little, so why not write fiction? Whether it's presented as fiction or presented as nonfiction. Nonetheless, we want to, just like, to go back to another classic example of inventing the Renaissance, right? Leonardo leaves behind so little ego documents that Sigmund Freud puts him on the couch and gives him a personality, reading the early original edition of Leonardo's notebooks at the beginning of the 20th century, right? That's a really very interesting example of this process that we're talking about, done as a famous historical case study in, human psychology, which also very much is a hinge, right, of the Leonardo myth. But to go back to the women, I mean, you can sort of say, not only do we want to give Leonardo's women personality, but we're also much more interested in, say, the female courtesans. Think of Sarah Donat's, very best-selling works on, novels on Renaissance women, right? She picks a wide variety, so which is wonderful. So she has kind of expanded the fictional possibilities of the Renaissance woman. But I think the one that made her famous was the one about a Renaissance courtesan, so we want the sensual Renaissance. We want the Renaissance of Titian's Venus of Urbino. We want the Renaissance of power politics, right? That's the TV Renaissance, especially, the Medici, the Borgias. We can never get enough of them. We play that over and over again in a variety of different genres, but especially in the last decade on TV.
Yeah, and yet within those we also curate to the versions of the personalities of the characters that fit what we're trying to do. I've been working recently on biographies of Lorenzo de' Medici and how polarized they are, and how very common it is for books about him or about people near him to decide to cast him as hero or to decide to cast him as villain, and then follow through and even make the same data support him being good or being bad because of the interpretation. When you look at his chronic illness and chronic pain, do you read this as, oh, this is gout and it's proof of his opulent living, or do you read this as this is a disabled man who nonetheless heroically, achieved so much. Which way you read the same fact will be determined by where within the drama, which often comes down to heroes and villains, you want to put things. And I think we should turn to Q&A soon, but I want to add one more thought, which I'd love to hear, Paula, you comment on. I think that because of the remnants of Whig history, because of the remnants of the idea of there being a forward and a backward, of history being teleological and going toward this gradual unrolling of the liberalized, modern democratic present, of there being a correct and an incorrect. That has affected the Renaissance in particular, though all eras of history, in making people want to categorize every figure as either on the right track, an enemy of the right track, or a branch line that goes nowhere. So that you pick out Leonardo, you pick out Poggio's encounter with Lucretius, you pick out Petrarch, and you say, these are people who are advancing it forward, Machiavelli. These are people who are advancing it forward. And you pick out another figure like Savonarola to cast as, this is the retrograde, this is the thing pointing it back. Without room in it for, well, actually, Savonarola was interested in a lot of different and innovative and reformy ideas, and was very much a figure doing new and innovative stuff. And then you also have figures like Marsilio Ficino, who's doing wild Platonic mysticism and projecting his soul out of his body, to put as, well, that happened, but doesn't feel like forward or backwards. So we sort of relegate that to, that's the sideline of the Renaissance, but the centerpiece are the people who feel closer to us. The centerpiece are the people who feel like a step forward. And so very frequently when the question comes of who do we advance from the middle of importance to the foremost of importance, who becomes the household name, we pick the people who resemble us and the people who resemble enemies of becoming us, so that we can construct these narratives of hero and villain, which are so convenient for narrativizing history as having a trajectory. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think, I agree with you that I think that's how we tend to simplify the past, right? Is that we want to cleave, and that's why it is that the look to the left, look to the right is such a clear instantiation of this. Let's put everything and call it medieval over here, or old, or antiquated, or mystical. Let's put all this other stuff there, and that's going to be the new, the modern, the Renaissance, and that impulse never entirely goes away. I think that's right, and it leads to sometimes very one-dimensional portraits of people, because we're not willing to see this other side of them, to see that they're entangled in both, that the two are not easily separated, and of course that's a lot of the work that scholars do, is to try to make it more complicated. And yet one of the challenges always is how to make that greater complexity engaging and interesting and relevant to a broader public, like the one that has kindly joined us here today. You have to, you have to think about how these two things work together. And so, like, I'll take an example like Catherine of Siena. No question, Catherine of Siena is a mystic, and as a result, she lives on that cusp of the late 14th, century. So, for us, she's clearly medieval. And yet there are many features of Catherine that strike me as being as Renaissance as Petrarch, who after all is older than her. Yep. And she's, he's, in his 40s by the time she's born, right? Because she's born the year before the Black Death. And yet her literacy and her public use of it, and her books are Renaissance bestsellers, right? She is the only female author that Aldus Manutius, the rock star Venetian printer, publishes. And he publishes Petrarch, and of course then all Aristotle and Greek and all this other stuff. And, but that's actually really important. That's a good example of complicating that Aldus picks her out, and we can explain why, because we can explain how important the cult of Catherine is in Venice. And, probably there are 6 degrees or less of separation between that cult and Aldus's print shop. So it may even be very personal, but it's reflective of broader trends, right? That there are many Renaissance readers of Catherine of Siena, even though she is a medieval mystic.
Yeah, there's so much Renaissance enthusiasm for things we don't think of as Renaissance that we have to sit down and say, you know, Savonarola, he was really popular. All these people became enthusiastic about him. So much so that even when he was dead, and then the city was taken over by the Medici, and then has this brief final republic again in 1532, what do they do in their brief final republic? They say, let's be Savonarolan again. Not let's be Machiavellian again, let's be neoclassicizing again. It's let's mysticism even harder. That's the last phase of the Florentine Republic. And it's usually left out of histories of Renaissance Florence because it cuts against the grain so much of what we want the Renaissance to be, a modernizing, proto-democratic, anti-mystical change. We don't have room in it for it to have tried out being literally governed by Machiavelli and then saying, well, now that we have a chance to be a republic again, let's have mystic nuns back. But that's really what happened. And we don't understand the Renaissance unless we understand a Renaissance where we have room for that to be what really happened.
Yeah, no, that's a terrific point. And I feel like now we probably should turn
Yes.
this over to an open discussion with our audience, which I'm looking forward to.
Thank you, Ada and Paula. That was wonderful. And we have some really great questions in the chat right now. So I'm just going to get started. And of course, whomever wants to, to pick up the question first or both together, however you'd like to do it. So Joan asks, regarding how writers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries have told us what to think about the Renaissance for their own purposes, how do today's writers tell us what to think about past eras, even those as recent as the 20th century? And how can we resist what they say?
I don't know, Ada, do you want to, I'm thinking about that. That's a great question. If you have anything, I'm happy to let you take the lead.
I think one of the best ways is to not only look at multiple histories of the same moment, but to try to look for a history written by somebody from a different country from the other. Because one of the most fascinating and useful things you can do is realize that even the Renaissance that you learn about in textbooks in the US, very different from the Renaissance you learn about in textbooks in France. Very different from the Renaissance you learn about in textbooks in Italy. And the Cold War from the POV of an American historian who identifies with one of the superpowers. Very, very different from the Cold War from the POV of a historian in France who is not one of those superpowers and is in between those superpowers. In my science fiction hat, I study a lot of Japanese science fiction and Japanese anime manga, and boy, is it fascinating to compare a Japanese space opera based on World War II to an American space opera based on World War II, because the ways you come to terms with what happened are very, very different when you are writing it from the point of view of the, yay, we were the victor and we were the good guys, versus the, actually, we're pretty sure we were the bad guys, and now we have to come to terms with the trauma of living with that guilt. So no matter what the era is, if you say, okay, I have read a history of this by somebody from X country, look for a history of it by somebody from a different country who has a different side on the same conflict, because the breadth between those two will help open up, wow, okay, there's going to be a lot of different interpretations of this same. Paula, do you want to supply suggestions too?
Yeah, no, I think that fundamental premise, right, about gaining different perspectives, and you can also see what kind of Renaissance are you especially looking for? So if, for instance, you're looking for the Renaissance, of Leonardo. I mean, there are a lot of popular books on Leonardo, and many of them are very repetitive, and some of them are not great at all. And then ones like Walter Isaacson's are not bad because it's a pretty fair synthesis of a lot of work. But I would say, hey, why read that if you could go read Martin Kamp's short, accessible book on Leonardo, because he truly is a Leonardo scholar. So I think one of the hard things always is not all scholarly writing translates well for a general readership, and we acknowledge that, right? Too many footnotes, too much specialist language. So I'm not going to send you to that type of book unless you really want to dig in, and you'll build up to that. I mean, we can all read those books. None of Ada and I didn't start off knowing how to read specialist works. We've arrived there, and we now contribute to it because we kind of built that up. But that's a long-term investment. Not everyone's going to dig in. And
well,
so I think just trying to sometimes figure out who are the interesting public commentators on a subject. Like I hope I won't annoy Ada about this because she is a Lucretius expert, but I send people to Steve Greenblatt's The Swerve, not because it's all right, but because it's not all wrong, and it's beautifully written, and it's stimulating and provocative. But I also tell them they should go read your book and Jerry Passanante. They should, if they want to read more and get a different perspective on just what is this moment of rediscovering Lucretius and the Renaissance, that book is not going to answer all their questions, hardly, but it's a good entry point, right? To read The Swerve.
And that's exactly an important thing, because one of the things that makes scholarly, anyone can read a book with footnotes. Everyone on this call has that skill, but a lot of scholarly books don't establish why you should care about the topic. They don't open the door to you because they assume you're already a specialist. And at the section at the beginning of any book that is sort of justifying why the book exists and getting you interested, they'll be like, why you should be interested in this particular intervention into the application of the Baron thesis to Naples. And, because that's what a specialist needs, because we already know all of that stuff, but they don't give you the why you should care about these. It's like picking up volume 8 in a series where you're supposed to already know the characters, and so the author isn't bothering to introduce the characters because they assume you already know the characters. That's what a lot of academic books are impenetrable like. It's not that you can't understand them, it's that they don't open the door. They expect you to already be in there, already be familiar with the time and place, and already care. And they don't try to make you get invested. Greenblatt's The Swerve is very good at making you get invested in the Renaissance. And once you have read a few books about a time period so that you are invested in it, you do know the basics, then you can go to just about any specialist work. And no matter how specialist it is, you're fine. Because the difference is not that you don't have the skill to read through footnotes or read an academic book. It's that you need that first introduction before you can then go to things that don't bother to give you a first introduction because they're aimed at specialists. Just like volume 10 of a detective series where you're supposed to already know Sherlock Holmes and it doesn't explain who he is. And you got to know before you get there, right? You got to know what's up with the Baron thesis in Naples before you read a book about the Baron thesis in Naples, which is what looking for accessible histories makes essential.
So we have a question from Mary, who asks if you could both address when did the phrase Renaissance man become used and about whom? Can this be associated with a description of a particular person or a group of men?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not a phrase of this earlier period. So maybe Ada will have a more precise answer. I am not thinking of exactly when the phrase Renaissance man came in, other than to guesstimate that it's somewhere between the end of the 19th and mid 20th century. So that's a very broad swath. And it's certainly associated with people like Leonardo. People say he's the quintessential Renaissance man. But of course, we point to others, so it's a way, there is a cast of characters. Leonardo looms large, but Michelangelo, the Medici, the Machiavelli is also an ultimate Renaissance dude. Ada, what else would you say?
I could be misremembering, but I think I was told at one point that the first usage is in a biography of Leon Battista Alberti.
Oh, that would make sense.
From the very early 20th century. And Alberti being a figure who is an author and an artist and an architect and a philosopher and a theurge and a mystic, but who also in his works was trying hard to intellectualize art. And one of the transformations that happens in the Renaissance, and that Vasari is also core to, is the elevation of painting and sculpture from being regarded as handicrafts like carpentry to being regarded as intellectual labor like poetry. Michelangelo's family was ashamed of him when he decided to become an artist instead of a banker, because it meant working with your hands. And that is a lower status occupation than doing intellectual labor. In this era before the second half of the 1500s, we're in an era where, for example, because a doctor is an educated profession, a doctor doesn't touch the patient with his own hands. That would be beneath a doctor. A doctor stands there with a volume of Galen and maybe looks at the color of your urine. The doctor's assistant touches you. And there's a wonderful book by Pablo Moret called The Forgotten Sense about the transformation of touch over the course of the 16th century. But Alberti actively worked on depicting art and architecture as intellectual labor rather than handicraft labor, and is one of the first figures to group that side of artistic production with philosophy and with literature. Because when we say Renaissance man, we often mean polymath, but we mean polymath very much in the intellectual labor sense. And if you're describing someone as he's a real Renaissance man, he plays the guitar and he is a mathematician and he writes poetry. If you then said also he whittles, people would be like, whittling doesn't go with the other things. It's an activity someone could have, but it's not a Renaissance man activity, because we don't perceive it and characterize it as intellectual labor. If I said, and he makes wood sculpture, then it would feel like intellectual labor and Renaissance man. And so I think that Alberti and figures like that who were involved in the intellectualization and elevation of art to being intellectual labor are key to the Renaissance man concept, which really does focus on having a polymath of intellectual labor.
Yeah, and I would add versatility too, that, right, ability to, translate skills from one thing to another with a kind of fluidity. And, so this is what, one of the key terms that provides the seeds of the idea of the Renaissance man does come from a book of this period, Baldassare Castiglione's book of the Courtier, which creates this beautiful fictional portrait written in the early 16th century of what a Renaissance court, in this case, the court of Urbino, is like. And they describe the ideal characteristics of the male and female courtiers. And, out of this comes, this great long Italian word, sprezzatura, right? Which sometimes people translate as nonchalance, but really it's the art of making difficult things seem easy. It's an effortlessness. One of my students a few years ago told me that word has shown up in GQ now as a way of kind of, got spreads, right? You've got fashion sprezzatura, so there are ways in which, of course, ingredients of the period then provide. And I agree completely with Ada that Alberti, this great theorist of everything that is, artisanal and artistic, who also is a great literary figure, and I mean, just many, many things. He is that universal Renaissance man, and he does invent himself and provide the ingredients of then describing the Renaissance man or attributing these characteristics then to Leonardo, who is a reader of Alberti, because Alberti is of an earlier generation when he writes his treatise on painting and on architecture. Yeah.
Thank you both. Bruce has a question and asks, what might trigger a healthy Renaissance period today? Does the collapse of trust in politicians, bankers, and other traditional pillars and recent loss of trust in crypto ripen conditions for trust in art, journalism, and science to be revived?
It's a big question that Bruce has asked about, and of course, I think it speaks to our desire to always have the Renaissance be an optimistic touchstone, that it will do good for us, to have a Renaissance, right? Or we would say to, push the, to do a reset, and restart things, to regain something, right? To rediscover, Yeah, I mean, so it would surprise me to see ways of talking about what needs to be regained, say in politics or in human, use this as one of the touchstones for talking about things. I think it doing so tends to move pretty far away from what it was. Anyone who's looked at how the Medici controlled the ballot box, as we would call it nowadays, in the Florentine Republic, know that nobody should trust that ballot box unless you're a Medici. And so perhaps the reality of the Renaissance offers opposite lessons, right, of what to be cautious about. Actually, the ideals of the Renaissance, of course, can inspire, so the Renaissance offers both. I think it's an object lesson and a warning. And yes, it can be nonetheless a source. I mean, there's a reason people who are not just specialists in the Renaissance still find reading Machiavelli to be very illuminating, because he managed to offer lessons that were specific to his own time and place, and yet transcended it, could be applied, could be recognized in many different kinds of societies. And so my thought actually would be to Bruce or anyone interested like that to go read some Machiavelli and see what it makes you think of.
And to read Machiavelli's personal letters as well, from which what you get is the reminder that indeed the idea of a rebirth is an excellent one. And I'll talk about trust when I get to the end, because I think that's actually an information technology thing, which I'll get to. But one of the things about a golden age is that it can mean two different things. It can mean an age that left us beautiful, glittering treasures, an age that we look back on its works and say, wow, an age that is famous, an age that decorates our museums. Or it can mean an age when it was good to actually be alive, and that if you had a time machine, it would be on your short list of, yes, I'd like to live at that time. The Renaissance, not that time. And the more you get to know it and read it, the more the lived experience of the Renaissance was clearly apocalyptic. There's an amazing letter of Ercole Bentivoglio to Machiavelli. This is a nobleman who was hired by the Florentines to be one of their mercenary captains and had worked with Machiavelli. And Machiavelli had just finished a short history of that decade, the decade that spans the year 1500. And he wrote sort of half a history of it, but not the second half. And Ercole wrote to him and said, Machiavelli, you must finish your history, because without a good history of these years, future generations will never believe how bad it was. And they will never forgive us for having lost and destroyed so much so quickly. He is describing the decade in which Michelangelo's David was made and Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa. And to live through it felt like living in an apocalypse, which is not a golden age in one sense, but definitely the golden age of our museums. The Renaissance didn't trust its government at all. When you read the personal letters back and forth, it's everything is corruption, everything is bribery. Here's who bribed who in the latest papal election. I study the papal election of 1492 in great detail, and I've looked at a lot of its fictional representations. And I tell you, both of the Borgia TV series super toned down how corrupt it was, because they knew their viewers would never believe how corrupt it was. And they had to make it less corrupt and less untrustworthy and introduce characters who are shocked that there is bribery at the Vatican. No one was shocked that there was bribery at the Vatican. That's what the Vatican was. They had to tone it down for us because we aren't prepared for how, in fact, corrupt it was. So in that sense, the produce of amazing wonders and the lived experience of chaos, distrust, and emergency are not incompatible. And if we wish for a Renaissance, we do not want to wish for the political half. As for the question of trust in journalism, trust in science, etc., I work a lot on information technologies. If you go to voices.uchicago.edu/censorship, you'll see my project on this. But every arrival of a new information technology, which makes information move faster and more freely, results in a giant surge of paranoia, fringe politics, fear, and distrust. Because every new information technology that arrives, there aren't good ways in place yet to censor the scary voices. And the first adopters of the new information technology will be the marginalized groups on all ends of the political spectrum. When the printing press spreads enough for there to be pamphlets, boom, every country in Europe is having a giant crisis as fringe religious movements and fringe critics of the government are suddenly able to speak when they weren't able to speak before. All information revolutions, radio, innovations in theater, every single documented information revolution triggered exactly what we're living through, this moment when all of the scary voices are magnified by the new infotech. The Renaissance did experience that in the dissemination of the printing press, and before that in innovations in the speed and efficiency of manuscript production. But that is a technology core issue and is going to balance out as we develop new methods as a culture to curate and find reliable information among the sea of unreliable information. And if we want to do that better, we want to look at the last 5 times humanity had to do it with its last 5 information technology revolutions, which can give us models.
Thank you both. Excuse me, Paul asks, what impact did the Renaissance have in different parts of Europe? And how did it impact the common man, the rural population?
Yeah, no, that's always a great question, right? You know, one of the ways this question was crystallized is many years ago in the mid-70s, a historian named Joan Kelly wrote a very famous essay called "Did Women Have a Renaissance?" And people have been answering in different ways that question ever since, but I take that as an example of like who had a Renaissance. You know, so the question of, you know, what penetrates beyond the cities is always, I mean, there's always a big fall off. You know, starting with literacy, right? Who is literate? But that doesn't mean that there's an absolute divide. You know, Tuscany, for instance, was famously described as at the time as a region with the pen in hand. You know, even the very small communities had, you know, the rural notary, the local schoolmaster, you know, often, I mean, a little bit more literacy than we might expect. You know, but obviously only a tincture, only morsels of what you would see in these big cities where everything is happening. And yet, it's important to remember how many of these people we think of as, you know, the Renaissance men often came from these rural communities into the cities. You know, the Medici were from the Mugello, you know, which is a very kind of rural mountainous region in Tuscany. And, you know, people famously talked about these many artists who, you know, had come from small communities, et cetera. So, you know, there are ways to kind of recapture that interplay between the cities, the countryside. Another way to answer this is to think about the world of artisans, which in a way we've kind of hinted at by talking about people like Alberti and Leonardo and Michelangelo, and you know, the other side of Michelangelo's family, obviously, you know, people of a certain status being horrified he was going to work with his hands, is the reverse, right? These artisans who aspire to, you know, become, you know, quite literate and become authors. And want to convey their expertise with this newfound literacy in, you know, in writing, even in print. And so you do see a kind of, you know, a real uptick in artisanal literacy. So that's kind of the middle ground between what about the peasants, right? The farm workers, you know, in which, you know, very little of this is going to penetrate. But I would like to argue bits, yes, you know, and of course, what about, you know, the people who have all the resources? They obviously, they're the patrons, you know, they're the people who you know, who make many of these things happen because they wish to.
Yeah, a quick example and then a simile. In Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, one of the scenes involves a ballad monger, a traveling peddler. He sells, you know, ribbons and shiny buttons and baubles from the city, and he sells printed pamphlets. And he comes to a community of very, very rural farmers, and they crowd around him and they ask, this pamphlet, what does it say? What is this one about? What is this one about? And he tells them, this is a satire, this is a romance, this is a story about a war that happened. Most of them are ballads. Most of them are verses for a familiar song, but a familiar tune, but with lyrics about some new current event. And they buy him out. And they're all clearly illiterate. They have to ask him what they say, but they buy him out because they're going to take those to the local schoolmaster or to the local priest who will read them aloud to them, and they're going to learn them. We have to remember the importance of the semi-literate literary market. And jumping forward a little bit more in time, during the American Revolution, there were more copies of Thomas Paine's Common Sense printed in the colonies than there were citizens living in the colonies. This in a world which was nowhere near 100% literacy rate, but having it, possessing it, following it along a bit as someone else is reading it out, were key parts of literary penetration. So the culture does reach the countryside, but its movement and the movement of art is very much the same trajectory as the movement of a disease. And you've all been familiar with these maps. It'll jump from capital to capital, from the big metropolis to the second metropolis, and then to the smaller towns around that, and then it'll migrate out, right? So if there's an artistic innovation in Florence, very rapidly it's in Barcelona, and it's in Székesfehérvár in the capital of Hungary, and it's in a capital in Poland. And then a few years later, it's in the smaller cities around there. And then it's being seen by the farmers who go into those towns to sell their goods. It does penetrate, whether it's a work of art or an artistic style, but it jumps first from capital to capital, so that in a sense, in terms of transit time, Florence to London, faster than Florence to Bergamo, in terms of how quickly something might actually penetrate, different from our culture of cars, right? So it does affect it very much in that way. The second way it affects it is, if there's a war and the war is because the king of Hungary is married to a princess from Italy, and the reason he's married to the princess from Italy is a bunch of stuff that was shaped by Italian Renaissance politics, you might live or die because of that. You might never have heard of the artists and architects and innovations that resulted in that, but boy, was it because of those cultural things that she was such a desirable queen, that the king of Hungary married her, that then her allies in Ferrara were or weren't there to help fight against Turks, or in Transylvania or Dalmatia, and your village has either burned or not because of art you never saw, but which has a power in politics that has these consequences. So that's the other way that it's affecting rural lives.
Yeah, no, if I'll just add a coda on that, one of the most famous Renaissance prints, German Renaissance prints, right, Durer's, what's called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, it captures this broad effect, right? War, famine, disease, these are the things, death, these are the things, that everyone shares. And he turns it into a very famous artistic allegory.
Thank you both. I just have my eye on the time here. I can't believe it, but right, we are kind of at time right about now. So I'm so sorry to everyone that we weren't able to get to your question, but I really want to thank you, for asking those questions in the Q&A and for sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much. And Ada and Paula, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, or we can hand it over to Dan then as well.
I think in the interest of time, I'll just thank everyone for being willing to join us today and talk about the Renaissance. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure. I see in the Q&A there was a question about the impact of the fall of Byzantium. Super short answer. Lots of scholars with Greek come west. Lots of artistic innovators and political figures come as refugees. It causes a huge cultural surge. That's the only one of the questions that I saw that I could give a decent answer to quickly. So I just thought I would do that one. Thank you all. I'm sure both Paula's website and mine are covered with recommendations and links and things for enjoyable Renaissance reading. I don't know, Paula, if you want to just recommend two approachable to anybody fun Renaissance reading books that they might want to read after this.
Well, okay, we've already mentioned Stephen Greenblatt's The Swerve. I think that's a good one to recommend. Another one that actually gets at this issue of what's the relationship between, ordinary people, rural lives, and the Renaissance is Natalie Zeman Davis's The Return of Martin Guerre. Then you can see the film, which is a beautiful historic film that was Gérard Depardieu that was done around the same time that book came out in the 1980s. But I think those are two very different and wonderful starting points for the Renaissance.
I'll add a very, very new book because I just read it and am in love with it. Jane Stevenson has a new book called The Light of Italy, which is a biography of Federico da Montefeltro, whose portrait one sees as one of the very first celebrated Renaissance works when one goes through the Uffizi. And it's a wonderful portrait of the intersections of culture, art, and war that so defined the period, and it's really good. And I always like to point people who want a sort of a robust overview to Guido Ruggiero's uninspiringly titled The Renaissance in Italy. But it's a big, solid, deep, good, immersive cultural and intellectual approach to the period. And I've had a lot of people who wanted I want a big chewy bite of Renaissance history, really liked the Guido Ruggiero, The Renaissance in Italy.
I thought of one other while Ada was talking that I would be remiss if I didn't say. So Ross King, good translator of scholarly work into popular books on the Renaissance. His most recent book is simply called The Bookseller of Florence. And it is the story of a 15th century celebrity bookseller, right? Sells to the Medici, to the Duke of Urbino. And so it's a wonderful story about the world of manuscripts on the cusp of printing and the love of books in the Renaissance. So Ross King, The Bookseller of Florence, highly recommended.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Paula.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's great to do this.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you both. It's always great when conversations end with some good book recommendations that can keep us going for a while. And I just want to thank you both, Professors Findlen and Palmer, for your great presentations today. You really gave us a lot to think about and certainly helped us think about the Renaissance in a different, deeper kind of way. So thank you. And just before closing, just want to say a quick thanks to all of our students. Thank you for joining us today. It's been wonderful bringing together these different learning communities and doing something together. And we look forward to seeing you in future courses and events. And just finally, I want to thank our partners at the University of Chicago. It's been great working on this series where we're putting different faculty members from our universities in conversation. It was a brainstorm we had a while ago, and it's been really fun working with you throughout this year. So I just want to say thanks to Seth, Sarah, and Brianna. You've been great partners, and we look forward to staying in touch. And thank you. Just to sign off, I want to say thank you, take care, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye-bye.